Hello, I'm Steve Young, and welcome to GM Locks, the Inside Story. This tape is intended for the beginning and trainee locksmith. This is the first in a series of Tech Train tapes which will teach the all-important basic skills that a locksmith must have in order to be truly successful. In this video, you will learn how and why the GM Sidebar lock works. You will learn how to disassemble, reassemble, make keys for, and rekey these locks. We'll cover the 5 basic types of GM locks: door locks, steering column locks, in-dash ignition locks, trunk locks, and glove compartment locks. You will also see what goes wrong with these locks. You will learn what the most common problems are and how to solve them quickly and easily. You will learn how to remove an in-dash ignition lock when there is no key available. You will also learn how to make trunk keys from the 3 most common types of glove compartment locks using the progression chart which came with your tape. As we go along, be prepared to pause or rewind your tape until you have learned each technique. Understanding the GM Sidebar lock inside and out is vital to any locksmith who's going to do automotive work. Let's start by discussing the tools we'll be using in this tape. One of the most important tools that you can have for working on GM locks is the Briggs & Stratton AS 1975 Automotive Service Manual. This valuable book is the most complete source of information on not just GM locks, but Ford, Chrysler, American Motors, and many commercial truck locks as well. The main part of the manual is made up of yearly lock and key catalogs from the last 20 years. Each catalog lists all of the locks and lock parts for each vehicle by model year. The parts are listed using the Briggs & Stratton part numbers as well as the vehicle manufacturer's part numbers. This information alone can save hours of your time if you have to get a part from the dealer. The next section of the manual is the lock service instructions. In here you will find instructions for servicing almost any automotive lock made by Briggs & Stratton. There are illustrated instructions for servicing locks found on the very old cars as well as the new cars. For instance, this is an illustration of how to remove the cylinder from a 1953 DeSoto trunk lock. And this is how to assemble the ignition lock for a 1984 Chevrolet. The last part of the manual is made up of service bulletins. If you order the service manual using the order form which came with your tape, you will receive additional service bulletins for as long as you remain in business. In addition to the service bulletins, you will receive annual price lists and lock and key catalogs which lists what parts are new or have been discontinued. As an added bonus, for ordering the Automotive Service Manual, you will receive 30 free GM key blanks and the 1988 Automotive Security Catalog in quick reference. This book lists the most up-to-date information on parts for the new cars. Now let's go on to hand tools. This is a plug holder which is used to hold the core of a GM lock while it's being serviced. This simple tool is a real time saver. It is possible to work on these locks without one of these, but the lock can be easily damaged. Notice a slot milled into the side of the plug holder to accommodate the sidebar. In order to service GM door locks and trunk locks, it's necessary to remove the chrome cap which covers the face of the lock. This can be done with a normal pair of side cutters or with a special cap removing tool. This is a much easier tool to use than the side cutters, and it's also safer. Using this tool, you're much less likely to cut yourself on the sharp edges of the cap. These are homemade staking tools. They've been made from a punch, a screwdriver, and a chisel. These tools are used to secure the tumbler cap and the sidebar retainers into place on the sides of the lock. They can also be used for reinstalling the chrome cap over the face of the lock. This is a bezel nut wrench, which is used for loosening and tightening the bezel nut which holds many GM glove box locks in place. These are 2 different types of decoders which are used to determine the depths of the cuts on General Motors locks. This is a set of General Motors depth keys. These are used for cutting General Motors keys from code on a conventional duplicating machine. These are 2 different types of code clippers which are used for cutting General Motors keys from code by hand. These are very handy tools. This is one of many different types of code machines. These machines can be used to originate General Motors and other types of keys from code. We won't go into the usage of these machines because there are so many different types. Now let's go on to how sidebar locks work. These are the various parts which make up a General Motors door lock. This is the retainer clip which holds the lock in the door. This is the housing of the lock which holds everything together. This is the lock pawl, or the cam, which attaches to the back of the lock and activates the lock mechanism inside the door. There are a lot of different types of these and vary from model to model. This is the retaining clip which holds the lock pawl onto the back of the lock. This is the gasket which separates the lock from the door. And this is the bezel or cap which goes over the face of the lock. This is the shutter door which protects the lock from dirt and water. There's a key blank through this one for illustration purposes. This is the plug or core of the lock. Let's take a closer look at this and the components that go inside of it. At the bottom of the screen are the 5 different General Motors tumblers. Depth number 1 is on the left and 5 is on the right. Notice the V notch on the right hand side of each tumbler. This V notch is what makes the whole system work. When the tumblers are in the correct position, the sidebar will drop into this notch. Notice that the notch is at the lowest position on the number 1 tumbler and at the highest position on the number 5 tumbler. This is the surface of the tumbler which rides against the key. If the key has a deep cut in it, then the V notch on the side of the tumbler will sit lower. If it has a high cut in it, the V notch will sit higher. The upper row of tumblers are the tumblers which were taken out of a lock. There are 6 tumblers in each lock. These have been in use for some time. Notice that all of the edges are slightly worn, especially where the key rides against the tumbler. The spring which holds pressure against the tumbler sits on top of a small post in the opening of the tumbler. If it were not for this post, the spring would slide off and get fouled in the keyway. Here we have a close-up view of 3 new tumblers. This is a number 1, a number 3, and a number 5. You can easily see the difference between the placement of the V notch on the right-hand side of the tumbler. Notice also that the tumblers are stamped with the depths. Not all of the tumblers have the depths stamped on them, but you will find a lot that do. You can also quite clearly see the post which holds the end of the spring on these tumblers. Here we have 2 used sidebars. Notice the 6 shiny spots along the edge of this one. That is where the sidebar has been in contact against the sides of the tumblers. When the V notches all line up in a straight line, the sidebar drops into the space created by that V notch. The sidebar is pushed inwards by 2 light coil springs which are located here and here. When the correct key is inserted into the lock, the sidebar drops into the V notches in the tumblers. The top of the sidebar then disengages from a milled slot in the housing of the lock, allowing the plug to turn. This is an old-style sidebar which was discontinued quite a few years ago. The retainer and the springs are permanently attached to the sidebar. You will very seldom see one of these. You can easily see the edges of the tumblers through the slot where the sidebar goes on this General Motors door lock. We're going to insert a key blank. Watch for the V notches as they move up. They're all going to move to the highest position. Notice that they do not line up, especially the first one. Watch again as the key blank is removed. Now we're going to insert the correct key into the lock. Watch how the tumblers line up with their V notches down the center of the slot. If the sidebar had been in place in this slot, it would have dropped in at this point, allowing the cylinder to turn. Watch again as we remove the key. Now let's go through the complete process of disassembling and making a key for a General Motors door lock. The lock pawl or cam is held onto the back of the plug with this clip. Using an ice pick or a scratch awl, lift the tab out of its hole and slide the clip off the post on the back of the lock. Once the clip has been removed, the clip and the pawl will simply lift off of the post on the back of the lock. The next thing to do is to carefully remove the gasket which is around the lock. These gaskets will get brittle and will very often break. It's a good idea to keep replacement gaskets in your truck. After the gasket has been removed, we then need to remove the face cap or bezel from the lock. On this lock, we'll be using a pair of side cutters or dikes to remove the bezel. Always be very careful when you're doing this. It's very easy to cut yourself with the razor-sharp edges of the bezel when you tear it off. Go around the edge of the bezel, breaking loose little pieces of it until you have the edge of the bezel loose from the lock. Once the bezel is free of the lock, be careful that the shutter door does not fall out. There are two relatively heavy springs behind the shutter door which will have a tendency to push the shutter door out of the lock. Once you're finished removing the bezel, be very careful how you dispose of it. Don't leave it where someone can cut themselves with it. Before we go on, let's illustrate how to remove the bezel using a pair of bezel removing pliers. Notice that the jaws grip the edge of the bezel much easier than the side cutters did. Slowly work your way around the edge of the bezel until the bezel falls off. It is possible to remove a bezel so carefully with this tool that you can actually put it back on the lock, but this is something to be done only in case of emergency where you don't have a proper bezel. Removing the bezel this way is much easier, safer, and it looks more professional to the customers. Once the bezel has been removed, the lock will simply fall apart. However, the small springs underneath the shutter door have a tendency to get lost if you just dump it out. We're working over a carpet sample. This makes a very convenient, cheap, and easily replaceable work surface, and when springs fall on it, they don't go very far. After the springs have been removed, simply pull the plug out of the housing. There's the keyway, there's the sidebar, and on the other side is the tumbler cap. The next step in making a key to this lock is to determine the depths of the cuts. We'll do this by picking the lock and reading the depths of the tumblers through the holes next to the tumbler cap there. Holding pressure against the sidebar and raking it with a pick, you can pick the lock into the unlocked position. You'll know it's unlocked when the sidebar drops into the down position. Hold pressure against the sidebar and then observe the tumblers through the holes. The cuts of this lock are a 5, 3, 3, 2, 1, 1. The deeper the tumblers are inside the housing of the lock, the deeper the cuts. Judging the cuts by eye requires a little practice. This is one of several decoders which are on the market to help you determine the cuts on General Motors lock. Pick the lock and insert the tip of the blade into the hole until it just touches the top of the tumbler. If the shoulder of the tool rests against the outside of the lock, you've found the correct depth. This one is too shallow. Go down the length of the lock, trying each tumbler one at a time until you have determined the correct depths. It is then very easy to cut a key for the lock using the depths that you have determined. This is another decoder which decodes all 6 cuts at the same time. Simply slide the prongs of the tool against the tumblers and push down on the body of the tool until it contacts the lock body. Hold it very straight. Then use the chart which comes with the tool in order to decode the cuts. Reading from left to right, the cuts on this key are 4, 5, 4, 3, 4, 5. Next, we'll illustrate the use of depth keys for cutting keys from code. We'll be using the same depths that we just decoded. A set of General Motors depth keys consists of 5 separate keys. Each individual key has the same cut in all 6 positions along its length. There are 5 separate keys, one with each depth. The cuts on this particular key are 4, 5, 4, 3, 4, 5. We'll cut all of the number 4 cuts first. The first position, the third position, and that was the 5th position. Now we'll change over to the number 5 depth. After the key has been inserted into the key machine, make sure that it is realigned with the key that you're cutting. Then we'll cut the number 5 cut in the number 2 position and the number 5 cut in the number 6 position. This will leave us with only one cut left to cut, the number 3 cut, which is located in the number 4 position. Insert the correct depth key into the key machine and realign the keys. As you make your cuts, try to clean the sides of the cuts up as well as possible. Be very careful, though, that you don't slip off and accidentally destroy one of the cuts that you've already made. Always wear safety glasses whenever using any key machine. Your vision is the most valuable tool you have. Cutting a key using depth keys will leave you with a very rough key. The burrs must be removed before inserting the key into the lock. We're using a square file here, but a round file or a pippin file would work just as well. The important thing is to make sure that you don't accidentally deepen any of your cuts. Simply clean up the burrs around the edges of the cuts. Next, we'll cut the same key using a Curtis number 14 clipper. This is a very nice clipper which is unfortunately no longer in production. The depth is controlled by the lever, which is operated with the right thumb. The spacing is controlled by the knob, which is operated with the left hand. Raising the lever deepens the cuts. Lowering it makes the cuts shallower. Different manufacturers' cuts are in different positions on the dials, and the dials are interchangeable. This will cut a very clean key. Very little cleanup is necessary after the key has been cut. As you can see, the key is pretty clean already. Simply knock the burrs off with a file before you insert it in the lock. This is a number 15 Curtis clipper. This clipper replaced the number 14. The key is inserted on the left-hand side of the machine and clamped into the carriage. Carriages are specific for individual keys, just as they were with the 14 clipper. Spacing is controlled by the dial on the left, and all of the cuts are set at one time using the interchangeable cam sets. There are cam sets and carriages available for almost all automotive applications. Unlike the number 14 clipper, this clipper is still in production and can be purchased from Curtis Industries. I personally, however, prefer the simplicity of the 14 clipper. Once the depths have been set into the cam set, the key is cut by squeezing the handle for each cut and progressing to the next cut by turning the dial on the left. This machine will produce a key that is just as clean as the key that was produced by the 14 clipper. Just a slight touch-up with the file is all you need. If instead of making a key for the lock, we had been intending to rekey the lock, we would have to remove the tumblers from the side of the lock. In order to do this, you must pry up the tumbler cap. Be very careful here because it's very easy to break. As a matter of fact, I'm about to break this one. All it takes is a pull at the wrong point. Be careful of the springs popping up through the side. Pry gently along the side of the cap next to the ends. Once the cap comes up on one end, hold down on that end while you pull up on the second. If you're not careful, you'll do what I'm about to do here and snap the tumbler cap off from the post that is inside the lock. There it went. It's in two pieces now. After the cap has been removed, take the springs out of the holes and then take out the tumblers. We'll show you how to remove that broken piece of the tumbler cap in just a moment. Removing the tumblers with a pick is usually a very simple operation. This particular lock came from a wrecked car and had been sitting for a long time and was very stiff. Usually you can push them up far enough to where you can reach them with a pair of tweezers. Sometimes you can remove pressure on the sides of the tumblers by lifting the sidebar slightly, and the tumblers will simply fall out of their sockets. This particular lock did not want to cooperate at all. Remember the way that the tumblers are built. The sidebar is resting directly against the side of the tumbler. Removing the pressure will loosen up the tension on the tumbler, and they will usually slide out. Usually, if you're going to have trouble with one tumbler, it will be the number 1 tumbler. This is the one that gets the most wear and is very often deformed from having the key placed into the lock somewhat crooked. Eventually, it will come out though. Grasping the top of it with a pair of tweezers, pull it straight out. Another way of determining the cuts for General Motors locks is to remove the sidebar and insert a key blank or depth keys into the keyway and observe the positions of the notches in the sides of the tumblers. In my opinion, this is much more trouble than it's worth. Putting sidebars back in is a lot of work. It's a very ticklish job. The retainer that we just removed there is what holds the spring in place. It's only necessary to remove one retainer. Simply lift the sidebar from one side and pull it straight out. Be careful not to lose the springs. They're very, very light springs. Notice the shiny parts on the edge of the sidebar where the tumblers have been resting against it. Here we're removing the second spring. Once the sidebar has been removed, you can see the sides of the tumblers quite easily. We've already removed the tumblers from this one. Now that we've completely disassembled the lock, it's time to show you how to remove that broken piece of tumbler cap. Protecting the top of the lock with a screwdriver, take a sharpened scratch-awl or an ice pick, press into the piece of tumbler cap, and pry upwards. It doesn't take a lot of pressure. The important thing is to have a sharp tool. Here's the broken piece, and here's the other piece of the tumbler cap. Knowing how to remove broken tumbler caps without damaging the lock is very important. Most of the repair work you do on General Motors locks will involve tumbler caps. That is by far the number 1 cause of trouble with GM locks. The pressure of the springs against the bottom of the tumbler cap has a tendency to push it loose from its socket, and when it raises up into the housing of the lock, it will either jam the lock in place, or when the lock is turned, it will shear off one or both ends of the tumbler cap. At the top are 3 broken tumbler caps, and at the bottom are 3 intact tumbler caps. Now it's time to reassemble the lock. We're installing new tumblers. We'll drop the tumblers into their slots one at a time, remembering to face the V notch towards the sidebar. After the last tumbler is in place, make sure that all of the tumblers are completely seated. Notice that the number 2 tumbler hasn't gone all the way down. Push them down with a pick or something like that. Now it's time to install the springs. 1 spring per tumbler in the center of the hole. When the last spring is in place, it's time to install the new tumbler cap. Never try to reinstall a tumbler cap that you've taken off, even if it came off intact. Always use a new one. They're simply not worth fooling with. The tumbler cap goes on in one specific direction. The folded down edge goes away from the sidebar. The tumbler cap should slide into place easily. If it doesn't, clean the slots. Do not force it. When the tumbler cap is in its proper position, it's ready to be staked into place. Very carefully use your staking tool to peen the edges of the lock housing over the top of the tumbler cap. Make sure that the tumbler cap is properly held down. You don't want it coming up again. The lock body itself is made out of a die-cast material and can very easily be cracked. Be careful that you don't use too much force when you're staking parts into place. Installing the sidebar is a little trickier than the tumbler cap. Balance the spring on one end of the sidebar and push it underneath its retainer. This is much easier than trying to replace both retainers. Slide the sidebar into place and then drop the second spring into its socket. After the spring is in place, bring the retainer in and balance it on top of the spring. This will be somewhat easier to do if the key is in the lock while you're doing it. This will allow the sidebar to drop down and take some of the tension off the springs. Very carefully position the retainer in its correct spot and then stake it in place. As I said earlier, this is a tricky operation, and it's a good idea not to remove a sidebar unless you absolutely have to. Once the retainer is in its correct location, carefully stake it into place. Be careful that you don't accidentally stake the sidebar. Hitting the sidebar with your tool can deform the tumblers on the back side of the sidebar. We are now almost ready to reassemble the lock. This is a shutter door. Occasionally these will come apart. There's a wire that goes through the spring and holds everything together. Notice that the two legs of the spring are on the door, and the bend in the center of the spring are against the face of the shutter. And at last it's time to reassemble the lock. This is the housing, and that's the plug or core of the lock. Insert the plug with the sidebar into its slot in the housing. There are two springs underneath the shutter door. Insert them into the two holes in the face of the lock. The ends of the pin which hold the shutter door on fit into the notches in the top and the bottom of the face of the lock. Hold the shutter door into place against the spring tension and install your bezel. This is a replacement bezel. It has 4 tabs which can be bent around the face of the lock. Install the bezel over the shutter door, making sure that the shutter door doesn't pop out. Turn the lock over so that the bezel is face down on a hard surface. This particular surface is a steel plate which has a piece of carpet glued to the other side. This is very handy for working on these locks. Gently tap the 4 tabs so that they will hold the bezel into place. Do not try to flatten them all the way at this point. After all 4 of the tabs have been bent in so that the bezel will not pop off, remove the lock to a surface that is relatively soft so that you will not scratch the bezel. At this point, use your staking tool and a hammer to completely flatten the 4 tabs that are attached to the bezel. These tabs must be completely flat, otherwise they will scratch the car or make it very difficult for you to get the retaining clip that holds the lock into place onto the lock. Next, install a new gasket if you have one, or very carefully reinstall the old gasket, and then try your key. The key should turn freely and easily. If the cylinder is bound up, you may have the bezel on improperly, or the shutter door may have come loose. Install the lock pawl back over the post. The clip which holds the lock pawl into place is slightly bowed. The bow must go up. After the clip is over the post, push it into its home position using a screwdriver. Remember that it has a square tab on it which must snap into the small hole on the lock pawl. If it doesn't want to go into place, help it with an ice pick or a scratch awl. Now that the last step is complete, try the lock again, and the job is complete. This is a typical General Motors trunk lock. Many of the techniques that we learned with the door lock will be the same on this one. The bezel is removed and replaced in exactly the same fashion. The tailpiece or cam of the lock simply snaps underneath that spring. The spring is responsible for returning the lock to the unlocked position after it's turned. Remove the spring by prying gently underneath this lip. Pull the end of the spring up and let go. Make sure your fingers are out of the way. It can come around with enough speed to punch a hole in the end of your finger quite easily. We've already removed the bezel just like on the door lock. Notice that the keyway is off-center on GM locks. The wide side of the lock is where the sidebar is located. Trunk locks, unlike door locks, must be turned before they can be disassembled. This means that if we don't have the key for the lock, it's necessary to pick the lock. In order to pick the lock, you have to put pressure on the sidebar. In order to put pressure on the sidebar, you have to drill a hole through the side of the lock. The sidebar is located on the wide side of the keyway. The center of the sidebar is located 5/8 of an inch back from the face of the lock. Center punch your hole so that you're drilling precisely where you want to. After the lock has been center punched, drill about a 1/8 inch hole through just the outside of the lock housing. Be very careful not to drill into the sidebar. You'll feel the tip of the drill bit break through the outer housing of the lock and touch the sidebar. Once it breaks through, very carefully clean your hole, and then you're ready to pick the lock. Notice that the hole goes right straight through to the sidebar. You can move the lock from side to side and see the sidebar move. Pick the lock by inserting an ice pick or a scratch awl through the hole that you've drilled, putting pressure on the sidebar, and raking the tumblers. You'll feel the sidebar drop in once the lock is picked. As soon as the lock is picked, maintain pressure on the sidebar so that it will turn, and then turn the lock clockwise. As soon as the lock begins to turn, you can release the sidebar. Turn the lock a little more than half a turn and push out. Then turn back counterclockwise until the core will push straight out the front of the shell. Notice the mark on the sidebar where we drilled it. You want to be as close to the center as possible. Notice the similarities between the door lock and the trunk lock. The door lock is at the bottom and the trunk lock is at the top. Everything we learned about the door lock applies to the trunk lock. The only difference comes in reassembling the lock. There's a lug on the back of the core of the lock. This has to interlock with a lug on the housing. Turn the lock until the lug will pass the outer lug. Turn it back to the locked position and remove the key. Notice the lug on the plug, which goes over top of the housing and comes up against the stop lug on the outside of the housing. Now it's time to rewind the return spring around the trunk lock. The inner hook of the spring goes over the lug on the back of the plug. The outer loop of the spring goes over top of the lug in the housing. Wind it around until it will snap into its slot. And that's all that's involved in rewinding the spring. After the spring has been installed on the plug, try the key and make sure it will spring back. After a new bezel and gasket have been installed on the lock, simply insert the hook of the tailpiece or cam underneath the spring and it will lock into place. Insert the key one more time and make sure that the lock will turn freely. And that completes the trunk lock. There are two basic types of steering column locks. This is the older type. We'll discuss this one first. There is normally a ring right here which has been removed for illustration purposes. We'll show you what it looks like a little later. This little spring-loaded pin is what stops the lock from turning further to the left. Once that pin has been depressed and the lock turns to the left, the core of the lock will slide straight out. The lock does need to be in the unlocked position. The tumblers have been removed from this lock so that we can show it to you simply. The core of the lock has 3 lugs which fit into these 3 slots on the inside of the housing. The plastic piece, which slides back and forth here, is what operates the buzzer switch. This is the same type of lock with a very common problem. The tumbler cap has popped loose and has jammed the lock. We've already forced it back into the unlocked position, and now we're manipulating the buzzer switch activator so that it is disengaged from the core. Once that has been done, the core of the lock will slide straight out of the housing. There's the tumbler cap. This one has sheared loose on both ends. Again, this is a very common problem. You'll see this all the time. It normally happens in ignition locks and trunk locks for some reason. When it happens in an ignition lock, it will either lock it in the locked position or it will jam it in the on position. This is the same type of lock again. There's nothing wrong with this one except we don't have a key for it and there's no code on it. We're going to go ahead and disassemble this one and make a key. The timing ring that we're removing here is responsible for stopping the lock in the off position before it gets to the accessory position. Simply insert a screwdriver under the ring and pry it gently off. Like the trunk lock, this lock must be turned in order to be disassembled. Again, the sidebar is on the wide side of the plug, perpendicular to the keyway. We'll be drilling a small hole again, just like we did with the trunk lock. The measurement is slightly different on this one. It's 7/8 of an inch as opposed to 5/8 of an inch for the trunk lock. Measure back to that point, mark your spot, and drill it just like you did with the trunk lock, and then pick it. Once the hole has been drilled, pick the lock in the normal fashion, place a nice pick through the hole, depress the sidebar, and then rake the tumblers. Once you feel the sidebar drop in, turn the core of the lock to the left towards the accessory position. Once it is in that point, the stop lug will be up against the brass pin that we showed you earlier. Use a pick or a paper clip to depress that brass pin, which will allow the lock to turn into a position which is just past the accessory position. At this point, the core of the lock will slide straight out. Reassembling this lock is basically the reverse of disassembling it. Make sure that the 3 lugs on the core line up with the 3 slots in the housing. Slide the washer with the tab into that slot and insert the core. It may be necessary to push up on the buzzer activator in order to get it into place. Then, when it is inside the housing, simply turn it to the right. It will snap past the brass pin that you had to push down earlier to disassemble it, and it will no longer come apart. At this point, it's time to install the timing ring on the back of the lock. Set the wings of the ignition lock down into a vise. It's not necessary to clamp it tight, just give it a place to sit, and then put the tab of the timing ring against the roll pin, which is embedded into the back of the ignition lock. Slide the timing ring down onto the core and then lightly pin it into position. There's no stress on this timing ring, so it's not necessary to pin this very heavily, just enough so that it won't fall off while you're trying to put the lock back into the steering column. After the timing ring has been pinned into place, try the key in the lock one more time just to make sure it works before you reinstall it. This is the newer ignition switch. This one is held together by a retainer which is driven through the side of the lock housing and rides in a slot in the lock core. To remove the retainer, drive a pin punch into the round depression until the retainer pops out the other side. There is a rectangular slot on the opposite side of the lock, and you can see the back end of the retainer at that point. Drive the retainer straight out. Notice that the large end of the retainer comes out first. It must be reinstalled in the same manner. This type of lock has a timing ring just like the lock we saw earlier. We removed it before we started on this one. It's exactly the same. Depressing the buzzer activator will release the core of the lock from the housing. Once these 2 plastic parts are disengaged, the lock will slide straight out. It's not necessary to turn this lock, so you can take it apart whether you have a key or not without drilling. Notice the slot at the midpoint of the lock core. This is where the retainer sat when the lock was assembled. Reassembling the lock is exactly the reverse. Simply slide it into place, making sure that the tabbed washer fits into its slot, and remove the key in the proper position. Hold the lock together with your fingers while you slide the retainer back into place. Make sure that the lock will still move back and forth inside the housing before you drive the retainer in. Once the retainer is all the way in, it's necessary to pin over the edges of the hole to keep it from falling out. After this has been done, reinstall the timing ring on the end of the cylinder just like on the earlier lock, and the job is complete. And that brings us to in-dash ignition locks. These locks are found on vans and trucks and older model cars. They are designed to be removed only if you have the key. The key is inserted into the lock and turned into the accessory position. Then a paper clip or other such object is inserted into the poke hole, allowing the lock to turn another notch. This will allow the core to come out. Usually the code will be stamped on the core. Removing these locks without the key is quite a different task. First, you have to remove any housings that cover the face of the lock. The facing of the lock cylinder is too large to fit through the nut which holds the lock in place. In order to reduce the size of the face of the lock, very gently pry off the chrome face cap. There are openings at the top and the bottom of this face cap. Gently pry along the top and the bottom until the cap pries loose. Be very patient with this. You do not want to scar this up. Take your time and get it off very carefully. Once the chrome cap has been removed, the outer diameter of the core will be small enough to fit through the nut which holds the lock in place. It will not fit easily. It will be necessary to drive it through. Once the face cap is off, the lock can be driven through the nut without doing any damage to the threads. If the face cap was on, it would never have fit through. Once the face cap is off, all that remains is to loosen the nut and drive the lock through. There are special wrenches made for removing these nuts, but I usually remove them with a pair of snap ring pliers. Push the ends of the snap ring pliers into the depressions around the edge of the nut, clamping tightly, and then twist to unscrew. Sometimes you can grip the edge of the nut with a pair of needle nose pliers or vice grips to unscrew it. Unscrew the nut until it jams against the face of the lock. Then carefully tap the lock through using a wooden dowel. After the lock pops through on the inside, simply unplug the electrical connection from the back of the lock and remove it from the car. Next, we need to drill a hole into the housing of the lock above the sidebar. The drill point is 5/8 of an inch back from the face of the lock directly above the sidebar, which is located on the wide side of the cylinder perpendicular to the keyway. Always use a center punch so that you drill it exactly where you want to. Precision is important here. Before you start working on this or any other ignition lock, always be sure to disconnect the battery so that you eliminate the possibility of a short circuit while working with the ignition switch. And whenever drilling, be sure that you wear your safety glasses. No job is important enough to risk your vision. The housing on these locks is rather thick, but be careful that when drilling through the housing you don't inadvertently drill through the sidebar as well. You want to stop your drill the moment that it pops through into the sidebar chamber. Once the hole has been drilled, we'll pick the lock in the normal manner. Insert an ice pick and put pressure on the sidebar and rake the tumblers. When the lock is picked, you will feel the sidebar drop into its slot. Once the sidebar drops in, then it will be necessary to turn the lock into the accessory position. Use a screwdriver to do this. Now that it's in the accessory position, all we have to do is insert a paper clip into the poke hole and turn the lock into the next position to the left. This will allow the core of the lock to come out of the lock housing. As you turn the lock, remove the paper clip and the plug will turn to the left. The code number is usually located on the side of the core. If it's not there, you can pick and read the lock and make a key just as you did to the door lock. Now we need to reinstall the chrome faceplate over the lock core. Simply snap it back over the face of the lock, making sure that the keyway holes line up, and place the core face down on a hard surface. Then using a staking tool, go around the edges of the face cap and gently pin it into place. Do this lightly so that you do not scar the face of the lock. Now all you need to do is reinstall the lock housing into the car and then simply reinsert the plug using the key, and the job will be complete. And now we come to General Motors glove compartment locks. This lock is known as the Cowboy Hat Lock because of the shape of the knob. This lock must be picked into the locked position in order to disassemble it. First, latch the lock and then take the pressure off the latch, either by pushing it against the keeper or clamping it with a pair of vice grips. Exert turning force on the knob of the lock and rake the tumblers with a pick. After the lock is in the locked position, push down on the retainer which is visible through this hole in the top of the lock. Push down on each tumbler in turn as you pull out on the knob of the lock, and the core of the lock will slide straight out. Notice that the lock only has 4 tumblers and a retainer. On older model cars, the code number for the door and trunk lock will be stamped on the side of the lock. On newer ones, you can find the depths of each cut located on the sides of the tumblers. After the key has been made, slide the key back into the lock and you will see that it will pull down the 4 tumblers and leave the retainer straight up. In order to reinsert the lock into the housing, pull the key out, push down on the retainer, and push the key back in. This will hold the retainer down until the key is pulled out, and then it will pop up, holding the lock in place. In order to reinstall the lock, hold down on the retainer, insert the key, and pull up on the latch of the lock. The lock must be in the latched position. Then slide the lock into place in the locked position, remove the key, and the core of the lock will be permanently reinstalled in the lock housing. Many times you will find locks that are loose in the glove compartment door. To tighten them or to remove the lock, use the bezel nut wrench that we discussed earlier. Insert the end of the wrench into the bezel nut and loosen or tighten the nut while holding the lock from the rear. This next type of glove compartment lock is known as the radio knob lock because of the shape of the knob. Turning the knob on this lock retracts a spring-loaded bolt at the back of the housing. This lock must also be picked into the locked position before it can be disassembled. After the lock has been picked, insert a stiff wire or a paper clip into the hole in the top of the glove compartment door. Pull out on the knob of the lock while pushing down on the retainer, and the lock will come out of its housing just a little. Rake the tumblers with a pick while pulling outward on the knob, and the core of the lock will come out of the housing. Notice that this lock also has 4 tumblers and a retainer. A common complaint with this type of lock is that the knob is too hard to turn. Briggs and Stratton made a change in later versions of this lock to solve the problem. On the earlier locks, a drop of oil at the rear of the lock where the cam contacts the lock bolt will solve the problem. The codes are stamped on the tumblers in this lock just as they were on the other one. Insert a key blank into the lock and it will pull the tumblers up enough for you to read the depths off the side of the tumbler. The retainer on this lock works exactly like it did on the previous lock. Notice that you only get the last 4 cuts of the key from this lock. We'll discuss how to get the first 2 cuts of the key in order to make the key fit the trunk also in the next section. Installing the lock back into the housing is the same as before, except that it's not necessary to push down on the latch. Simply slide the lock into place, remove the key, reinsert the key, and turn the lock to the unlocked position. This is a sidebar glove compartment lock. The key is inserted and the chrome part slides from side to side to lock or unlock the glove compartment. This type of lock is very easy to work on as long as the glove compartment door is unlocked when you find it. If it's locked, you would probably be better off to disassemble the door and remove the lock from it in order to make a key. If the glove compartment is open, simply remove the 2 bolts which hold the lock in place and slide it out. There is a plastic cover which holds the entire lock assembly together. An inexpensive ballpoint pen makes an ideal tool for depressing the retainers which holds this cover on. Simply disassemble the ballpoint pen and use the hole in the top of the pen to push the cone-shaped retainers together. There's a cone-shaped retainer on either side of the lock. Simply slide the end of the ballpoint pen over the cone and push down. This will depress the ears of the retainer and push the clip loose from the housing of the lock without damaging it. Once it is popped loose, simply pry the retainer off and the lock will disassemble very easily. Remove the retainer, push the central part of the lock against the spring tension and slide it straight out of the lock. Notice that this is a complete sidebar lock. There's the sidebar and the tumbler cap is there at the left. A key can be made to this just like it was for the door lock. Notice that this is a complete key and has all 6 cuts. Watch the sidebar drop in when the key goes into place. Pop out as the key is removed. The sidebar goes into a chamber in the side of the lock housing and prevents the lock from sliding when it's in the locked position. Reassembly is the reverse of the disassembly. Simply slide the core of the lock against the spring and into the housing until it seats. It will move from side to side slightly against the spring tension. The plastic cover will go on 2 different ways, only one of which is correct. This is the incorrect way. Notice that the core of the lock is up against the side of the retainer. When the retainer is properly installed and the lock is in the unlocked position, the core of the lock will be almost in the center of the slot. Once the retainer is in the proper position, simply push it against the housing of the lock, snapping the cone-shaped retainers back into their holes. They will snap in and lock into place. After the lock has been completely reassembled, check all of its functions to make sure that it works properly before reinstalling it in the glove compartment. The earlier glove compartment locks that we showed you only had 4 tumblers. In order to make a key from those locks that will also fit the trunk, it's necessary to determine the other 2 cuts. This could be done with a trial and error method and would require approximately 10 keys to cover all the possible combinations. Fortunately, this isn't necessary. This is a progression chart. A chart similar to this was packaged along with your videotape. Using this chart, we can reduce the maximum number of keys that we would have to cut to 3, and this will cover all of the possible combinations. In order to do this, we must first understand one important thing about General Motors locks. In a factory-keyed General Motors lock, all of the cuts, if added together, will equal an even number. That means that the 2 missing cuts that we did not get by disassembling the glove compartment lock must add up to an even number if the other 4 cuts add up to an even number. If the 4 known cuts add up to an odd number, then the missing cuts must add up to an odd number in order to equal an even number. If we have an even number of cuts on the first 4 cuts of the key, then the first key that we would cut would have a 1-1 in the first position. We would try that key in the lock. If it does not work, we would move on down to a 1-3 using the same key blank. Next, we would cut it to a 2-4, still using the same key blank, then a 3-5, and then a 5-5. At that point, we would have cut that first key blank as far as it would go. Then we would have to go to the next key blank. We would cut it at a 3-1. If that didn't work, a 4-2, and then a 5-3. Then for our third and final key blank, if that didn't work, would be a 2-2, then a 3-3, and a 4-4. Notice that the chart is set up to give you the maximum number of cuts on the first key. If the first 4 cuts of the key added up to an odd number, we would start out with a 1-2 in the first position, then a 2-3, and then a 3-4, and then a 4-5. If those didn't work, we would move on to the next key, cut it at a 2-1. If that didn't work, then a 3-2, then a 4-3, and a 5-4. The progression chart that was included with your tape is somewhat different than this progression chart. The maximum difference between any 2 cuts which are next to each other on a General Motors key blank is 2. That means that you can never have a cut any shallower than a 3 next to a 5. Using this information, we can eliminate even more of the possibilities. If our first known cut that we obtained from the glove compartment lock is a 3, then we would have the maximum number of combinations possible, which is what we have here. If, however, our first known cut was a 1, we would be able to eliminate 7 of those combinations, and this is all we would have to cut. If our first known cut was a 2, then we would have only these combinations. If our first known cut was a 4, we would have these combinations. And if our first known cut was a 5, we would have these combinations. On the chart, which was included with your tape, the columns have been rearranged so that you have the maximum number of cuts on the first key. The guide, which was included with your video, has several examples of how to cut keys using the progression chart. This concludes GM Locks, the Inside Story. I hope you've enjoyed watching this video as much as I enjoyed making it. If you would like a list of other videos available from TechTrain, please write to us at this address: TechTrain Productions, P.O. Box 15401, Pensacola, Florida 32514. Or you can call our toll-free order line 1-800-356-0136. And thank you for choosing TechTrain.